The history of United Kingdom. Ancient era, from stone to steel. Picture a land of chalk cliffs and rolling hills, of ancient forests and winding rivers, where mist rises from moorlands and the sea is never far away. This is England, a place that has been conquered and has conquered, that has been shaped by waves of invaders and has sent waves of influence across the globe. From a remote corner of the Roman Empire to the heart of the largest empire the world has ever known, England's story is one of extraordinary transformation. Our journey begins not in history, but in prehistory, when the first humans walked across land that would one day be an island. Prehistoric Britain, 800,000 BCE, 43 CE. England wasn't always an island. During the last ice age, Britain was connected to continental Europe by a land bridge called Doggerland. Early humans, Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens, hunted mammoths and reindeer across these frozen plains. When the ice retreated around 10,000 BCE and sea levels rose, Britain was cut off from the continent, creating the English Channel. The people who remained became Britain's first islanders. They were hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following game and gathering plants. But around 4000 BCE, something revolutionary arrived from the continent: farming. The Neolithic Revolution transformed Britain. People settled, cleared forests, planted crops, and raised livestock. And they built monuments. Stonehenge. Even today, these massive stones standing on Salisbury Plain inspire awe and mystery. Built in stages between 300 and 2000 BCE, Stonehenge required extraordinary organization. The largest stones, called sarsens, weigh up to 25 tons and were dragged from quarries 20 miles away. The smaller blue stones came from Wales, over 150 miles distant. How did Neolithic people transport these stones? Why did they build this monument? We can only theorize: astronomical observatory, temple, healing sanctuary, cemetery. What we know is that Stonehenge represents a society capable of monumental collective effort, suggesting complex social organization and deeply held beliefs. Around 2500 BCE, a new people arrived, bringing bronze metallurgy. The Bronze Age had begun. These beaker people, named for their distinctive pottery, brought new technologies and perhaps new languages. They buried their dead in round barrows that still dot the English countryside. Trade networks extended across Europe. Britain produced tin, essential for bronze making, and became connected to a continent-wide economy. Around 800 BCE, ironworking arrived, ushering in the Iron Age. This period saw the rise of the Celts, though modern scholars debate whether Celts represents an ethnic group or a cultural pattern. What's certain is that Iron Age Britain was divided into numerous tribes: the Iceni, Brigantes, Catuvellauni, Trinovantes, and dozens more. These tribes built hill forts, fortified settlements on high ground like Maiden Castle in Dorset, which enclosed 47 acres within massive earthwork ramparts. Celtic society was hierarchical. Warriors formed an elite class. Druids, priests, judges, and scholars wielded considerable power. Bards preserved history and legend through oral tradition. The Celts spoke languages ancestral to modern Welsh and Cornish. They worshipped gods associated with natural features: springs, groves, rivers. They created magnificent art in flowing, curvilinear styles. They also fought constantly among themselves. This disunity would prove fatal when, in 43 CE, a new power arrived with overwhelming force. Roman Britain, 43 to 410 CE. In 43 CE, Emperor Claudius ordered the invasion of Britain. For legions, about 40,000 men, landed on the Kent coast. The Roman general Aulus Plautius advanced rapidly. Some British tribes resisted, others allied with Rome, seeing advantage in supporting the strongest power. The conquest took decades and was never complete. Wales resisted fiercely. The north remained contested. And in 60 to 61 CE, Rome faced its most serious challenge when Boudicca, queen of the Iceni, led a massive revolt. Boudicca's husband, King Prasutagus, had been a Roman ally. When he died, leaving his kingdom jointly to his daughters and Emperor Nero, Roman officials seized everything. Boudicca was flogged, her daughters raped. Boudicca's response was fury. She united the Iceni and Trinovantes and attacked Roman settlements. Colchester was destroyed. London, then a small trading town, was burned. A layer of red ash in London's archaeological record marks Boudicca's vengeance. Verulamium, St. Albans, was sacked. Perhaps 70,000 Romans and Roman sympathizers died. But Roman discipline prevailed. In a final battle, Boudicca's undisciplined warriors were slaughtered by organized legions. Boudicca poisoned herself rather than face capture. Rome's control was re-established, never again seriously challenged by native revolt. The Romans built Hadrian's Wall, begun in 122 CE, stretching 73 miles from sea to sea across northern England. This massive fortification marked the northern frontier of the Roman Empire and the civilized world. Beyond lay Caledonia, Scotland, which Rome never conquered. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain was Roman. Cities grew: London, York, Bath, Colchester. Roman roads, straight, paved, engineered, connected them. Villas dotted the countryside, centers of agricultural estates with mosaic floors and underfloor heating. Latin became the language of administration and commerce. Roman law governed. Christianity arrived, spreading gradually through the 4th century. Britain became Romano-British, a fusion of native Celtic and Roman cultures. The elite adopted Roman ways, wearing togas, speaking Latin, bathing in public baths. But Celtic culture persisted in the countryside, in language and custom, blending with Roman practice. But Rome was weakening. Barbarian invasions pressured the empire's frontiers. In 410 CE, Emperor Honorius told the Romano-British to look to their own defences. Rome had abandoned Britain. The legions withdrew, and Britain entered its darkest age. The Dark Ages, 410 to 871 CE. What happened after Rome left is shadowy, hence Dark Ages. Written records are scarce. Archaeology provides glimpses, but much remains obscure. What we know is that Romano-British civilization collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Trade ceased. Literacy nearly disappeared. Britain fragmented into competing kingdoms. And new invaders arrived. From across the North Sea came Germanic peoples, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, seeking land and opportunity. Whether they came as invaders, mercenaries, or migrants is debated. What's certain is that by the 7th century, they dominated England. The Romano-British were pushed westward into Wales and Cornwall, or assimilated. The newcomers brought their language, Old English, ancestor of modern English, and their pagan religion. England began to take shape as a concept. The land became Angleland, England. But it was divided into 7 major kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex, the Heptarchy. These kingdoms constantly fought for supremacy. In 597 CE, Christianity returned. Pope Gregory I sent Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons. Augustine landed in Kent, converted King Ethelbert, and established a church at Canterbury. Celtic Christianity from Ireland also spread into northern England. The two traditions differed on practices and authority. At the Synod of Whitby in 664, the Northumbrian Church chose Roman over Celtic Christianity, a decision with lasting implications, tying England to continental Europe rather than Celtic fringe. The conversion transformed England. Monasteries became centres of learning. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving knowledge. The Venerable Bede, a Northumbrian monk, wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People in 731, our primary source for early English history. Anglo-Saxon England developed a sophisticated culture. Epic poetry like Beowulf, though written down later, reflects this period's values: loyalty, courage, fate. Craftsmanship reached high levels. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, discovered in Suffolk, contained treasures rivaling any in Europe. But in 793, disaster struck. Vikings attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne, slaughtering monks and plundering treasures. The Viking Age had begun. The Viking Age, 793–1066. 4 decades, Viking raiders from Scandinavia terrorized England's coasts. These weren't random attacks. Vikings were skilled navigators and fierce warriors seeking wealth and land. Monasteries, wealthy and undefended, were prime targets. By the 860s, Viking strategy changed. Instead of raiding and leaving, they stayed. The great heathen army, led by legendary figures like Ivar the Boneless, conquered East Anglia, Northumbria, and much of Mercia. They seemed unstoppable. Only Wessex resisted. And Wessex had Alfred. Alfred the Great became King of Wessex in 871, inheriting a kingdom under siege. In 878, Vikings nearly destroyed Wessex. Alfred fled to the marshes of Somerset. Legend says he hid in a peasant woman's hut and was scolded for letting her cakes burn, a story showing how even kings could fall low. But Alfred counterattacked. At the Battle of Edington, he defeated the Viking leader Guthrum, forcing him to accept baptism and withdraw. Alfred negotiated the Treaty of Wedmore, dividing England. The Vikings controlled the northeast, the Danelaw, under their own laws. Wessex controlled the south and west. Alfred didn't just fight, he built. He created a network of fortified towns called burhs. He established a navy. He reformed law codes. He promoted learning, translating Latin works into English. He's the only English monarch called the Great, and deservedly so. He saved Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred's successors pushed back the Vikings. His son Edward and grandson Aethelstan gradually conquered the Danelaw. By 954, England was united under one king for the first time. The idea of England, not just a geographic expression but a political entity, had become real. But Viking pressure returned. In 1013, King Sweyn of Denmark conquered England. His son Nut ruled an empire spanning England, Denmark, and Norway. Nut was surprisingly effective, governing wisely and adopting English customs. But when his dynasty ended in 1042, the throne returned to Edward the Confessor of the old Anglo-Saxon royal line. Edward was pious, too pious to produce an heir. When he died in January 1066, he left no clear successor. His brother-in-law Harold Godwin's son seized the throne. But two others claimed it, Harold Hardrada of Norway and William, Duke of Normandy. 1066 would be England's most consequential year. The Norman conquest, 1066. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada invaded northern England with a Norwegian army. Harold Godwin's son marched north and defeated him at Stamford Bridge, killing Hardrada. It was a great victory. Harold's exhausted army celebrated. Then word came, William of Normandy had landed in Sussex. Harold rushed south, covering 250 miles in days. On October 14, 1066, the two armies met near Hastings. Harold's infantry held strong on Senlac Hill. William's cavalry charged repeatedly but couldn't break the shield wall. Then, whether by design or accident, the Normans feigned retreat. Harold's men broke formation to pursue. The Normans turned and slaughtered them. Harold died, struck in the eye with an arrow, according to the Bayeux tapestry. William had won. On Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman conquest transformed England. William replaced the Anglo-Saxon elite with Norman nobles who spoke French. He ordered a comprehensive survey of England's wealth, the Domesday Book, creating an administrative record unmatched in medieval Europe. He built castles, stone symbols of Norman power, across the land. The Tower of London began as William's fortress. England's language changed. The elite spoke Norman French. The peasants spoke English. For centuries, England would be linguistically divided. Eventually, the languages merged, creating Middle English, heavily French-influenced but fundamentally Germanic. This linguistic fusion gave English its extraordinary vocabulary, with multiple words for similar concepts: liberty, French, and freedom, English, commence, French, and begin, English. The Normans also brought new architecture, the soaring Romanesque style, with thick walls and rounded arches. Great cathedrals rose: Durham, Winchester, Canterbury, massive statements of power and faith. 1066 wasn't just a change of dynasty. It was cultural revolution, linking England firmly to continental Europe, to France particularly, setting patterns that would last centuries. Medieval period, kings, crusades, and Magna Carta. The Angevin Empire, 1154 to 1204. In 1154, Henry II became king, founding the Plantagenet dynasty. Through inheritance and marriage, particularly to Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry controlled not just England but much of France. The Angevin Empire stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry was more French than English, spending most of his reign in France. Henry II was a great king and a terrible father. His sons, Henry, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, constantly rebelled, encouraged by their mother Eleanor. Family dinners must have been tense. Henry also clashed with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, over church-state relations. Henry wanted to try criminal clergy in royal courts. Becket insisted on church courts. The dispute escalated. In 1170, Henry allegedly exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" For knights took him literally and murdered Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. The killing shocked Christendom. Becket became a martyr and saint. Henry did public penance, but his authority over the church was broken. When Henry died in 1189, his son Richard succeeded him, Richard the Lionheart, perhaps England's most famous king, despite spending only 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. Richard and the Crusades, (1189 to 1199). Richard I was a warrior king, obsessed with glory and crusade. In 1189, he departed for the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin. Richard won battles. His victory at Arsuf was brilliant, but couldn't take Jerusalem. He negotiated a truce allowing Christian pilgrims access, then left. Returning home, Richard was captured in Austria and held for ransom. England paid an enormous sum, 100,000 marks, to free him. Richard spent his remaining years fighting in France and died from an infected crossbow wound in 1199, aged 41. Richard left no heir. His brother John became king, John Lackland, the worst king in English history. King John and Magna Carta, 1199 to 1216. John was intelligent but paranoid, cruel, and spectacularly unlucky. He lost most of England's French territories to King Philip II of France, earning the nickname Soft Sword. He quarrelled with Pope Innocent III, leading to England's excommunication. He taxed his barons ruthlessly to fund failed military campaigns. By 1215, the barons had had enough. They forced John to meet them at Runnymede, a meadow by the Thames. There, on June 15, 1215, John sealed Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Magna Carta wasn't a democratic document. It protected baronial rights, not common people. But it established a revolutionary principle: the king was under law. Clause 39 stated, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." This became the foundation of English liberty, habeas corpus, trial by jury, legal principles that would spread worldwide. John immediately repudiated Magna Carta, triggering civil war. He died in 1216, possibly from dysentery, hated and unmourned. His 9-year-old son became Henry III. The 100 Years' War begins, 1337 to 1453. In 1337, Edward III of England claimed the French throne, triggering a conflict that would last 116 years. The 100 Years' War was really a series of wars over English claims to French territory. Initially, England triumphed. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen devastated French cavalry. At Poitiers in 1356, the English captured the French king. By 1360, England controlled a third of France. But England couldn't sustain conquest. France was larger, richer, and more populous. When Edward III died in 1377, his grandson Richard II inherited the throne as a child. Richard grew into an increasingly tyrannical king, eventually overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV, starting the Lancastrian dynasty. The Black Death, 1348 to 1350. In 1348, ships from continental Europe brought more than trade goods. They brought rats infected with fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, the bacterium causing bubonic plague. The Black Death swept across England with terrifying speed. The plague killed indiscriminately. Perhaps 40 to 60% of England's population died. Villages were abandoned. Fields went untilled. Labour shortages were acute. The social order convulsed. Surviving peasants demanded higher wages. Labour was suddenly valuable. Lords resisted, trying to enforce pre-plague wages. Tension built. In 1381, it exploded. The Peasants' Revolt, 1381. A new poll tax sparked rebellion. In June 1381, peasants and artisans from Kent and Essex marched on London.
Led by Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical priest John Ball, who preached when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. Rebels demanded an end to serfdom and reduced taxes. They entered London, executing officials and burning records. The young king Richard II, only 14, met the rebels at Mile End and promised reforms. But at Smithfield, the mayor of London killed Wat Tyler during negotiations. Richard faced the leaderless mob alone. "I am your captain, follow me," he declared. Remarkably, they did. He led them from London, and the revolt collapsed. The promised reforms never materialized. Leaders were executed. But the revolt showed that common people could challenge authority. Serfdom gradually declined, though not due to the revolt alone. Labor shortages and economic changes made it unviable. The Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1485. The Hundred Years' War ended in 1453 with England expelled from France, retaining only Calais. Defeat bred instability. King Henry VI was pious but mentally fragile. Noble factions competed for power. England descended into civil war. The Wars of the Roses pitted two branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, Lancaster, Red Rose, versus York, White Rose. These weren't ideological conflicts or popular movements. They were aristocratic power struggles fought by private armies. The conflict seesawed. The Yorkist Edward IV seized the throne in 1461. When he died in 1483, his brother Richard III took the crown, allegedly murdering Edward's young sons, the princes in the Tower, though this remains debated. In 1485, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant with a thin claim to the throne, invaded from France. At Bosworth Field, Richard III died fighting, the last English king to die in battle. Legend says Richard's crown was found on the battlefield and placed on Henry's head. Henry VII became king, married Edward IV's daughter Elizabeth of York, and united the houses. The Tudor rose combined red and white. The medieval period was ending. A new era, the Renaissance, was beginning. Early modern era, Reformation, Empire, and Revolution. The Tudor dynasty, 1485 to 1603. Henry VII was cautious, miserly, and effective. He avoided wars, filled the treasury, and established Tudor authority. When he died in 1509, he left his son Henry VIII a stable, prosperous kingdom. Henry VIII is England's most famous king, charismatic, ruthless, and married 6 times. He wanted a male heir. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him only a daughter, Mary. Henry wanted to annul the marriage and marry Anne Boleyn. Pope Clement VII refused, partly because Catherine was aunt to Emperor Charles V, who had political leverage over the Pope. Unable to get papal permission, Henry did something extraordinary. He broke with Rome. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 declared the King supreme head of the Church of England. The English Reformation had begun. This wasn't primarily theological. Henry remained doctrinally conservative. It was political. By controlling the Church, Henry controlled church wealth. He dissolved the monasteries, seizing their vast properties and selling them to nobles and merchants, creating a class with vested interest in the Reformation's permanence. Henry got his annulment and married Anne Boleyn, who gave him another daughter, Elizabeth. Disappointed, Henry had and executed on dubious adultery charges. He married Jane Seymour, who finally produced a son, Edward, then died in childbirth. Henry married 3 more times. His 6th wife, Catherine Parr,
outlived him. When Henry died in 1547, his son became Edward VI at age 9. Regents steered England toward Protestantism. The Book of Common Prayer established English language worship. But Edward died at 15 in 1553. Bloody Mary and Elizabeth I, 1553 to 1603. Henry's eldest daughter Mary became queen. A devout Catholic, she attempted to restore Catholicism, burning approximately 280 Protestants as heretics, earning the nickname Bloody Mary. She married Philip II of Spain, making England Spain's ally. She died childless in 1558, bitter and unpopular. Elizabeth I ascended the throne at 25. Her 45-year reign became England's golden age. Elizabeth navigated religious divisions skillfully. She established a moderate Protestant church, the Elizabethan settlement, avoiding extremes of Catholicism or Puritanism. She never married, using the possibility of marriage as diplomatic tool while keeping power undivided. She cultivated a cult of personality as the Virgin Queen, married to England itself. Elizabethan England flourished culturally. This was Shakespeare's era. His plays at the Globe Theatre captured human nature with unmatched brilliance. Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and others created literary masterpieces. English drama reached peaks rarely equaled. Elizabeth faced external threats, particularly from Catholic Spain. Philip II, ex-husband of Mary, resented Elizabeth's Protestantism and support for Dutch rebels against Spanish rule. In 1588, Spain launched the Armada, 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, to invade England. The English fleet, commanded by experienced seamen like Sir Francis Drake, attacked the Armada in the Channel. English ships were smaller but more maneuverable. They harried the Spanish ships with long-range gunnery. Storms completed the destruction. Less than half the Armada returned to Spain. The Armada's defeat secured Protestant England and established it as a major naval power. Elizabeth became a legend. But she left problems. She named no heir, creating succession uncertainty. And religious tensions, between Anglicans, Catholics, and radical Protestants called Puritans, remained unresolved. The Stuarts and Civil War, 1603 to 1660. Elizabeth died in 1603. Her cousin James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns, though not the kingdoms. James believed in the divine right of kings, that monarchs answered only to God. This clashed with Parliament, which believed it represented the people and controlled taxation. James's son Charles I inherited these tensions and made them worse. He was pious, stubborn, and convinced of his own righteousness. He tried ruling without Parliament, raising money through unpopular means. When he finally recalled Parliament in 1640, needing money to fight rebellions in Scotland, Parliament refused to cooperate without addressing grievances. Tensions escalated. When Charles tried to arrest 5 MPs in the House of Commons in 1642, civil war became inevitable. England split between royalists, cavaliers, and parliamentarians, roundheads. The Civil War was bitter, dividing families and communities. Initially, neither side had clear advantage. But Parliament controlled London and England's wealth. And Parliament found a military genius, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell created the new model army, a professional force selected by merit and motivated by religious conviction. At Naseby in 1645, Cromwell shattered the royalist army. Charles was captured, escaped, was recaptured. In 1649, Parliament put him on trial for treason. The trial was unprecedented, a king tried by his subjects. Charles refused to recognize the court's authority, but he was found guilty and sentenced to death. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was beheaded outside Whitehall Palace. England had killed its king. The Commonwealth and Cromwell, 1649 to 1660. England became a Commonwealth, a republic. Cromwell conquered Ireland with extreme brutality, massacring garrisons at Drogheda and Wexford. He defeated royalists in Scotland. He became Lord Protector, essentially a dictator, though he refused the crown. Cromwell was puritanical. He closed theatres, banned Christmas celebrations, enforced strict moral codes. England grew weary of Puritan rule. When Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard briefly succeeded but couldn't maintain authority. In 1660, General George Monck marched from Scotland and arranged the restoration of monarchy. Charles II, son of Charles I, returned from exile. England celebrated with relief. The experiment with republicanism had ended. The Restoration and Glorious Revolution, 1660 to 1689. Charles II was witty, pleasure-loving, and politically astute. He didn't want to go on his travels again, so he avoided confronting Parliament directly. But religious tensions persisted. Charles was secretly Catholic. His brother James, Duke of York, was openly Catholic. Parliament passed laws excluding Catholics from office and attempted to exclude James from succession. When Charles died in 1685, James II became king. James tried to promote Catholicism and rule absolutely. In 1688, when his Catholic wife gave birth to a son, creating a Catholic dynasty, Protestant nobles invited William of Orange, married to James's Protestant daughter Mary, to invade. William landed with an army in November 1688. James's forces deserted him. James fled to France. It was nearly bloodless, the Glorious Revolution. William and Mary became joint sovereigns, but with conditions. They accepted the Bill of Rights, 1689, limiting royal power and guaranteeing parliamentary rights. The Crown could not suspend laws, levy taxes, or maintain a standing army without Parliament's consent. Free speech in Parliament was guaranteed. It was a constitutional settlement, establishing Parliament's supremacy over monarchy. The birth of empire, 1600 to 1750. While political revolutions transformed England, another transformation was occurring overseas. England was building an empire. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, established trading posts in India. English colonies took root in North America, Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, eventually 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast. The Caribbean became dotted with English sugar islands worked by enslaved Africans. The slave trade was central to England's imperial economy. English ships carried millions of Africans across the Atlantic in horrific conditions. Perhaps 20% died during the Middle Passage. Survivors were sold into plantation slavery. The trade's profits fueled English economic growth, but at enormous human cost. England fought multiple wars with Spain, France, and the Netherlands for colonial and commercial supremacy. Naval power became essential. By the early 18th century, England had Europe's most powerful navy. In 1707, the Acts of Union united England and Scotland, creating Great Britain. England as a separate political entity technically ceased to exist, though the name persisted colloquially. The Industrial Revolution,
1760 to 1840. In the mid-18th century, Britain began transforming, economically, socially, and physically. The Industrial Revolution started here, and it changed everything. Multiple factors converged. Coal was abundant. A culture of innovation encouraged invention. Capital was available from colonial trade. Political stability fostered investment. And enclosure of common lands created a landless labor force. Inventions accelerated production. James Watt's improved steam engine, 1776, provided power independent of water or wind. Richard Arkwright's water frame mechanized cotton spinning. Power looms mechanized weaving. Suddenly, textiles could be mass-produced. Iron production soared with new smelting methods. Railways, using steam locomotives developed by George Stephenson, connected cities. The first railway, Liverpool to Manchester, opened in 1830. Within decades, railways crisscrossed Britain. Industrialization created cities. Workers flooded to Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds. Urban population exploded. Conditions were horrific: overcrowded slums, polluted air, child labor, dangerous factories. Life expectancy in industrial cities was shockingly low. But industrialization also created wealth, enormous wealth for factory owners and merchants. Britain became the world's workshop, its goods exported globally. By mid-19th century, Britain was the world's most powerful nation economically and militarily. Modern era, empire, wars, and transformation. Victorian Britain, 1837 to 1901. In 1837, an 18-year-old girl became queen. Victoria would reign for 63 years, giving her name to an era. Victorian Britain was the world's superpower. The British Empire covered a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed a quarter of humanity. The sun never sets on the British Empire wasn't hyperbole. At every moment, it was daytime somewhere in British territory. India was the empire's crown jewel. The East India Company had gradually conquered the subcontinent. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, when Indian soldiers revolted against British rule, the British government assumed direct control. Victoria became Empress of India in 1876. Britain's imperial mindset combined economic exploitation with a sense of civilizing mission. Rudyard Kipling's poem The White Man's Burden expressed this attitude: colonialism as duty to civilize supposedly backward peoples. This paternalistic racism justified controlling millions without their consent. At home, Victorian Britain was paradoxical. Enormous wealth coexisted with desperate poverty. Public morality was strictly conservative, yet prostitution flourished. Scientific progress and religious faith both remained strong. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, revolutionizing biology but challenging biblical literalism. Political reform gradually expanded. The Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884 progressively widened the franchise, though universal male suffrage wasn't achieved until 1918, and women had to wait even longer. Social reforms addressed industrial capitalism's worst abuses. Factory Acts limited child labor and work hours. Public health measures improved sanitation. Education became compulsory. Trade unions were legalized. Victorian culture left lasting legacies. Charles Dickens's novels exposed social injustices while entertaining millions. The Bronte sisters, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy produced literary masterpieces.
Victorian architecture, Gothic revival, exemplified by the Houses of Parliament rebuilt after an 1834 fire, still dominates British cityscapes. The Boer War and imperialism's cost, 1899 to 1902. In South Africa, British ambitions collided with Boer, Dutch, settlers. The discovery of gold and diamonds made the region economically crucial. In 1899, war broke out. Britain expected easy victory. Instead, Boer guerrillas fought effectively. Britain responded brutally, establishing concentration camps where Boer civilians were detained. Approximately 26,000 Boers, mostly women and children, died from disease and starvation in these camps, along with perhaps 20,000 black Africans. Britain won, but at enormous cost, financial, military, and moral. The war exposed imperialism's brutality and ND questioned its sustainability. It was an omen of empire's fragility. World War I, 1914 to 1918. In August 1914, Europe's long peace shattered. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia after Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, alliance systems dragged major powers into conflict. Germany invaded Belgium. Britain, guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany. Britain expected a short war. It lasted 4 years and killed 700,000 British soldiers and another 200,000 from the Empire. The Western Front became a horrific stalemate. Armies dug trenches from the Channel to Switzerland. Attacks gained yards at costs of thousands of lives. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 epitomized the war's futility. On July 1st, the first day, British forces suffered 57,000 casualties, 20,000 dead, the worst day in British military history. By battle's end, British and French forces had advanced about 6 miles at cost of over 1 million casualties. Soldiers endured unimaginable conditions: mud, rats, disease, constant artillery bombardment, poison gas attacks. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon captured the horror. Dulce et decorum is pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, Owen called the old lie. New technologies made killing industrial scale. Machine guns, artillery, tanks, aircraft, submarines. World War I was the first truly modern war, merging 19th-century tactics with 20th-century weaponry, maximizing slaughter. Women entered the workforce massively, replacing men in factories and farms. Their contributions strengthened arguments for women's suffrage. In 1918, women over 30 who met property qualifications gained the vote, partial victory for suffragettes who'd campaigned for decades. The war ended November 11, 1918, with Germany's defeat. Britain had won but was exhausted, traumatized, and diminished. The Victorian certainty was gone. The lost generation had been slaughtered in Flanders fields. And the seeds of World War II were already planted in the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The interwar years, 1918 to 1939. The 1920s brought relief but not recovery. The economy struggled. Unemployment remained high. Industrial disputes culminated in the general strike of 1926, when millions of workers stopped work in support of coal miners. The strike collapsed after 9 days, but it revealed deep class tensions. The British Empire remained vast but was weakening. Ireland, after the Easter Rising of 1916 and subsequent War of Independence, was partitioned in 1921. The Irish Free State gained independence. Northern Ireland remained in the UK, a compromise satisfying nobody, creating problems persisting today. In 1931, the Statute of Westminster granted dominions like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand effective independence while maintaining loyalty to the Crown. The Empire was transitioning into the Commonwealth. The 1930s brought the Great Depression. Unemployment soared to 20%. Hunger marches protested government inaction. In depressed industrial regions, entire communities faced destitution. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany was rearming. Britain's leaders, haunted by World War I's carnage, pursued appeasement. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met Hitler at Munich in 1938, allowing Germany to annex part of Czechoslovakia in exchange for peace promises. Chamberlain returned claiming peace for our time. Within a year, Germany invaded Poland. World War II had begun. World War II, 1939 to 1945. Britain declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. The phony war followed, months of inaction. Then in spring 1940, Germany's blitzkrieg conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France with shocking speed. At Dunkirk in May-June 1940, the British Army was trapped on French beaches. In a desperate evacuation using military vessels and civilian boats, over 300,000 British and French troops were rescued. It was a deliverance from disaster, but Britain had lost equipment and allies. Britain stood alone. Chamberlain resigned. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, offering nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. His speeches, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender," became rallying cries. Germany prepared to invade. First, it needed air superiority. The Battle of Britain raged in summer 1940. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered but aided by radar and fighting over home territory, defeated the Luftwaffe. Hitler postponed invasion indefinitely. Britain had survived. The Blitz followed, sustained bombing of British cities from September 1940 to May 1941. London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. Coventry was devastated. Over 40,000 civilians died. But Britain endured. The war became global. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, bringing America into the war. Churchill's strategy, survive until allies could help, was vindicated. British forces fought in North Africa, Italy, Burma, and eventually Western Europe after D-Day in June 1944. The war finally ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, VE Day, and in Asia on August 15, 1945, after atomic bombs forced Japan's surrender. Britain had won again, but at devastating cost. Over 450,000 military and civilian deaths. Cities bombed flat. The economy in ruins. Debt overwhelming. And the world had changed. America and the Soviet Union were now superpowers. Britain's global dominance was ending. The welfare state and decolonization, 1945 to 1979, 9. In July 1945, to Churchill's shock, voters elected a Labour government led by Clement Attlee. After 6 years of war, they wanted social transformation. Labour delivered the welfare state. The National Health Service, established in 1948, provided free health care for all, revolutionary and controversial. Education was reformed. Social insurance expanded. Key industries were nationalized. Britain was building democratic socialism. But Britain was broke. American loans kept the economy afloat. Rationing continued into the 1950s, and the empire was collapsing. India, the crown jewel, gained independence in 1947, partitioned into India and Pakistan amid horrific communal violence. Burma and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, followed. Over the next 3 decades, colony after colony gained independence, sometimes peacefully, sometimes after bitter struggles like in Kenya, Malaya, and Cyprus. The Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed Britain's diminished status. When Egypt's President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain and France invaded with Israeli assistance. American pressure forced humiliating withdrawal. Britain could no longer act independently as a great power. By 1997, when Hong Kong returned to China, the empire had essentially vanished. The Commonwealth remained, a voluntary association of former colonies, but without political power. Domestically, the post-war consensus, accepting the welfare state and mixed economy, persisted for decades. Conservative and Labour governments differed on details but shared basic assumptions. Immigration from former colonies transformed Britain. The Empire Windrush arrived in 1948 carrying Caribbean workers invited to address labour shortages. South Asians, Africans, and others followed. Britain became multicultural, though not without tension and racism. The 1960s brought cultural revolution. The Beatles, Rolling Stones, and British rock dominated global music. Swinging London set fashion trends. Social attitudes liberalized. Homosexuality was decriminalized, abortion legalized, censorship relaxed. Traditional Britain was changing. But economic problems persisted. The 1970s brought stagflation, high inflation plus low growth. Trade unions were powerful and strike-prone. The winter of discontent in 1978–79, widespread strikes leaving garbage uncollected and bodies unburied, epitomized the decade's dysfunction. In 1979, voters elected Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female Prime Minister. The post-war consensus was about to shatter. The Thatcher era, 1979 to 1990. Margaret Thatcher believed in free markets, privatization, and reduced government. She confronted trade unions, particularly during the miners' strike of 1984 to 85. After a year-long struggle, the miners were defeated. Union power was broken. Thatcher privatized state industries, telecom, gas, electricity, railways, water. She sold council houses to tenants. She cut taxes on the wealthy while reducing welfare spending. She declared there was no such thing as society, only individuals and families. Thatcherism transformed Britain's economy and politics. Financial services boomed. London became a global financial centre. But manufacturing declined. Northern industrial regions suffered devastating unemployment. Inequality widened dramatically. Abroad, Thatcher cultivated a special relationship with U.S. President Ronald Reagan. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982, she sent a task force 8,000 miles to recapture them. The war was controversial but successful, boosting her popularity. Thatcher was divisive, loved by supporters, loathed by opponents. But she dominated politics for 11 years. When her own party ousted her in 1990, the Thatcherite Revolution had remade Britain. New Labour and the Blair years, 1997 to 2010. In 1997, Tony Blair led Labour to landslide victory, ending 18 years of Conservative rule. But this was New Labour, accepting much of Thatcherism while promising better public services. Blair modernised Britain. He devolved power to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, creating regional parliaments. He reformed the House of Lords, removing most hereditary peers. He incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into British law. He invested heavily in healthcare and education. Living standards rose. Unemployment fell. Britain seemed prosperous and confident. But Blair's legacy is overshadowed by Iraq. After the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, Blair allied closely with President George W. Bush. He committed British forces to the invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq in 2003. Iraq proved disastrous. No weapons of mass destruction were found, sectarian violence exploded, and hundreds of British soldiers died. Blair's reputation never recovered. The 2008 financial crisis struck Britain hard. Banks collapsed or required massive bailouts. The economy contracted. Gordon Brown, who succeeded Blair in 2007, responded with stimulus spending. But in 2010, voters elected a conservative Liberal Democrat coalition promising austerity. Austerity, Brexit, and modern challenges, 2010 present. The coalition government, led by David Cameron, imposed austerity, cutting public spending to reduce the deficit. Welfare was cut. Local government funding slashed. Public services deteriorated. Inequality widened further. In 2014, Scotland held an independence referendum. The Union survived, 55% voted to remain, but the close result revealed deep divisions. Then came Brexit. In 2016, Cameron called a referendum on EU membership, expecting victory for Remain. Instead, 52% voted Leave. Cameron resigned. Britain faced its most consequential decision in decades. Why did Britain vote Leave? Reasons varied: immigration concerns, desire for sovereignty, economic anxiety, disillusionment with elites, nostalgia for past greatness. The campaign was bitter and divisive. Brexit dominated politics for years. Theresa May, Cameron's successor, struggled to negotiate withdrawal terms. Boris Johnson replaced her in 2019, promising to get Brexit done. In January 2020, Britain left the EU, the first member state ever to do so. Brexit's consequences remain unclear. Trade barriers increased. Northern Ireland's status remains contentious. Scotland's independence movement strengthened. Britain gained formal sovereignty but lost influence. The COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020. Britain suffered over 200,000 deaths, among Europe's highest per capita. The government's response was heavily criticised. Economic damage was severe. Social divisions widened. Johnson resigned in 2022 amid scandals. Liz Truss became Prime Minister but lasted only 49 days after her economic policies triggered financial chaos. Rishi Sunak replaced her, becoming Britain's first Prime Minister of colour, a milestone often overlooked amid economic crisis. In 2024, Labour returned to power under Keir Starmer, promising to rebuild public services and restore economic stability. But challenges remain immense: sluggish growth, crumbling infrastructure, underfunded healthcare, housing crisis, and climate change. Ending. How history shaped modern England. The legacy of history. To understand England today, you must understand its layers of history. Modern England is built on foundations laid millennia ago. From the Romans came roads, towns, and the concept of organized government. Roman Britain's urban centers, London, York, Bath, remain cities today. Latin influenced English through French, giving it vocabulary richness. Anglo-Saxon England established the English language and early institutions of governance. The concept of common law, law developed through judicial decisions, has Anglo-Saxon roots and spread throughout the English-speaking world. The Norman conquest created England's enduring class system. The aristocracy remained largely Norman-descended for centuries. French influenced English, creating linguistic class divisions persisting today. Medieval England developed Parliament, initially a royal advisory body, gradually becoming representative government. The principle that rulers require consent of the governed emerged here, eventually spreading globally. The English Reformation made religious identity political. England became Protestant in opposition to Catholic Europe. This shaped foreign policy for centuries and created sectarian divides, particularly in Ireland, with lasting consequences. The Civil War and Glorious Revolution established constitutional monarchy and parliamentary supremacy. These principles influenced later democratic movements worldwide, particularly the American Revolution. The Industrial Revolution began in England, transforming human civilization. England pioneered industrial capitalism with all its benefits: technological progress, increased wealth, improved living standards, and all its costs: exploitation, inequality, environmental damage. The British Empire spread English language, legal systems, and institutions worldwide. Over 60 countries gained independence from British rule. English is now the global language. Common law governs billions. Parliamentary systems exist across the Commonwealth. But empire also meant exploitation, slavery, racism, and violence whose consequences persist. World War I shattered Victorian certainties. World War II, despite victory, ended British global dominance. The welfare state emerged from post-war social democracy, reflecting belief that government should ensure citizens' well-being. Decolonization transformed Britain from imperial power to middle power. Immigration from former colonies made Britain multicultural, enriching culture but also creating tensions about identity and belonging. Thatcherism reshaped British capitalism, prioritizing markets over state intervention. Its legacy, financial sector dominance, regional inequality, reduced social solidarity, still defines British economy and society. England's global influence. Few nations England's size have influenced world history so profoundly. English is the global lingua franca, spoken by 1.5 billion people as first or second language. It dominates international business, science, aviation, and diplomacy. English law, particularly common law, governs billions. Legal concepts like presumption of innocence, trial by jury, and habeas corpus originated or developed in England and spread globally. Parliamentary democracy, government accountable to elected representatives, has English origins. While not invented entirely in England, the model of constitutional monarchy with parliamentary supremacy influenced democratic development worldwide. English literature, Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, the Brontes, Orwell, is world literature. These writers explore universal human themes while grounding them in English settings and history. English science and philosophy shaped modern thought. Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, English thinkers who revolutionized our understanding of physics, biology, politics, ethics, and economics. British institutions, the BBC, the monarchy, Oxford, and Cambridge, the Premier League, command global attention. British culture, music from the Beatles to Adele, television from Doctor Who to Downton Abbey, fashion, art, has global reach disproportionate to Britain's size. Contemporary England. Modern England faces an identity crisis. What does it mean to be English in the 21st century? Brexit revealed deep divisions between young and old, urban and rural, cosmopolitan and traditional, prosperous south and struggling north. England's relationship with its own identity is complicated. British was imperial identity, encompassing Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and overseas territories. As empire faded and devolution granted other nations' parliaments, Englishness emerged as distinct but uncertain. England is the only UK nation without its own parliament. Economically, England faces significant challenges. Post-industrial regions never fully recovered from manufacturing decline. London thrives as global financial centre, but prosperity doesn't spread evenly. Housing is unaffordable for many. Public services strain under funding pressures. Socially, England is diverse but divided. Immigration enriched culture but also sparked backlash. Racial discrimination persists despite progress. Class remains powerful, accents, education, and background still determine opportunities. Politically, trust in institutions has declined. Scandals, Brexit chaos, and COVID mismanagement eroded confidence. Young people feel alienated from politics that seems to ignore their concerns, housing costs, climate change, economic opportunity. Yet England retains considerable strengths. Its universities are world-class. Its creative industries, film, television, music, video games, punch above their weight. Its science and technology sectors innovate. London remains one of the world's great cities, multicultural, dynamic, globally connected. The NHS, despite chronic underfunding, represents a social commitment to universal healthcare that most English people deeply value. The principle that healthcare is a right, not a commodity, reflects values of solidarity and fairness that survive despite economic individualism. English culture continues evolving. Multiculturalism has enriched everything from food to fashion to music. British grime and UK drill influence global hip-hop. British curry has been called a national dish. The England football team reflects the nation's diversity. Final reflections. England's history is one of remarkable transformation through invasion, adaptation, innovation, and expansion. From Roman province to Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Norman conquest to global empire to modern middle power, England has repeatedly reinvented itself. This history of change suggests England can adapt again to 21st century challenges. But adaptation requires confronting uncomfortable truths. The empire, for all its architectural grandeur and administrative achievement, was built on exploitation and violence. The wealth that funded industrial revolution and Victorian grandeur came partly from slavery and colonial extraction. England's democratic traditions are admirable but incomplete. Full democracy, universal suffrage, equal rights, came remarkably late and only after long struggles by those excluded from power. England's global influence has been immense but not uniformly positive. English spread through conquest as much as culture. British institutions were often imposed, not chosen. Yet England has also contributed genuinely to human progress. The Industrial Revolution, despite its costs, enabled prosperity unimaginable to previous generations. Democratic principles developed in England inspired freedom movements worldwide. English science and literature have enriched human understanding and imagination. As England navigates the 21st century, it must balance pride in achievements with honesty about failures, confidence in identity with openness to diversity, respect for tradition with willingness to change. England's story isn't finished. The challenges ahead, climate change, economic inequality, social division, regional tensions, global instability, require the same adaptability that allowed previous generations to transform England repeatedly. From Stonehenge builders to Roman colonizers, from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to Norman conquerors, from medieval peasants to industrial workers, from imperial administrators to multicultural citizens, millions of people have made England what it is. Their legacy, cathedrals and cottages, castles and factories, laws and literature, triumphs and tragedies, shapes modern England. Understanding this history doesn't determine the future but provides context for creating it. Closing. England, ancient and modern, traditional and innovative, a land of Shakespeare and the Beatles, of medieval cathedrals and Premier League stadiums, of afternoon tea and chicken tikka masala. A nation that conquered much of the world and must now find its place in a world where empire is history. From the chalk downs where ancient peoples built Stonehenge to the streets of modern London where people from everywhere create something new, England's story continues. It's a story of power gained and lost, of cultures clashing and blending, of rigid class and social mobility, of conquest and creativity. The past weighs heavily here. You can't walk through English cities without encountering it. Roman walls, medieval churches, Victorian railway stations, war memorials. History isn't distant. It's all around, shaping the present in visible and invisible ways. England today is neither the imperial power of Victoria's reign nor the welfare state of Attlee's creation. It's something new, still forming, navigating between its history and its future, between insularity and openness, between tradition and change. What England becomes depends on choices its people make, how to address inequality, how to define identity, how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to contribute to a world facing existential challenges. This has been the history of England, from prehistoric stones to Brexit debates, from tribal kingdoms to global influence, from isolated island to connected crossroads. A history of transformation, adaptation, and endurance. A history still being written by people who inherit this complex, contradictory, fascinating legacy. The end. Subscribe to Timelines of Nations for weekly videos exploring the ancient to modern history of countries around the world.